We're gonna hear that right now, played on an instrument that sounds kind of like an organ. Well, thank you, Ellen. That's my wife, Ellen, who played that. And welcome to another racism panel dialogue. I'm Sam Meiskens, and I'm putting my reading glasses on because I got a few notes. Forgot to put them on. I'm Sam Meiskens, host of the dialogue tonight, and it's sponsored by Global Faith in Action and the Beyond Tolerance movement. The title of today's dialogue is No Justice Without Truth. Tonight, you will be listening to panelists who are anxious to discuss justice actions that we, the people of the United States, need to consider. 401 years after institution of slavery began in the United States of America, we are still struggling with the treatment of Black people, as well as such as Asian populations and so, who we could talk about sometime. But tonight, we are going to focus on Black people. So let me introduce the panel. Before I am further introducing the challenge, our panelists will be responding to questions in a little bit. But right now, I want to introduce the panelists. And the first three are new panelists that we have not had before on this program. So first of all, Janet Federico. Janet is, I think she can maybe wave her hand or so, and you can see where she is. Janet, we're glad you're there. I know you are introduced yourself with saying that you work with domestic violence and you're a member of the NAACP. And that's neat. Then we have Marvin Rice. If you could just raise your hand a minute so people can find you. Marvin Rice, we're so thrilled that you are with us. You're a police chaplain, I understand, and a missionary in Kansas, and you're also a member of the ISS Christian Center. So I'm glad that you are a part of this tonight. And then there's Mike Patton. Now, Mike Patton is he's a businessman, and he owns the termite and pest control business, I should say. He also is a member of West Heights United Methodist Church, which is using a book which I will talk about in a little bit. And I happened to hear Mike Patton at a church the other day, not this Sunday, but the past Sunday, talking about his own experiences that he's had in understanding this whole situation of racism. And he gave a really neat 5-minute talk. And so he'll have a lot to share with us as well. So Mike, we're glad you're on. Because I heard that, that's why I got a hold of him and said, why don't you come and be a part of our panel today? So those are the three new ones. Now we got Rabbi Michael Davis, the rabbi of Congregation Emmanuel. Each raise your hand as he did just there. We got Sister Deborah Dirks, a Muslim author, educator, and community organizer, Deborah. And then we have Reverend Carl Kirkendall. Is he arrived yet? He usually gets here a little late. But if you see him coming, you'll know that he is the pastor of the Bethany Baptist Church, and he's also president of the Greater Wichita Ministerial League. So I hope that he does show up. He put his finger up like that yesterday and said, I'll be there. So we'll see.
He just logged on.
I see that we are just right now adding Naeem Baout. Naeem, we're glad you have. We're just introducing the people right now. He's the president of the Al Bayt Islamic Center in Wichita. We're glad you are a part of this. And then we have Tony Brown. Tony Brown is a Christian promoter of peace throughout the world and an artist in residence at Heston College. And let's see, I don't think I've gotten Bill Van yet, have I? Bill, I'm glad you're a part of it. You're the pastor of the ISIS Christian Center. And I'm glad to have you with us again. Now, have I got everybody? I think well, there's a book. The author of the book is Sherry L. Mills. I know there are a lot of books in this world, but the title of this book is Lenten of Liberation, Confronting the Legacy of American Slavery. Now, I have to say, for some of you who are not Christian, it is a Christian book. And for a couple of you, I dropped the book off so you could just have a chance to kind of see what it has to say. But there's a number of things that I think are a big help to us in looking at this whole thing. And what's neat about this is that this book is being used all over the country in not only Methodist churches, but other churches as well. So the kind of questions that we're asking, I've taken from this book. And so you'll know what's being dialogued and discussed all over the country because we're using their questions mostly. So the very second paragraph of that book was quite something. It reads like this: Black people have experienced a Black Holocaust, enslavement, Black codes, sharecropping, Jim Crow, lynching, redlining, restrictive covenants, police brutality, subprime lending, and a massive incarceration, all of which have resulted in the ghettoization and impoverishment of Black communities across America. That's the second paragraph of the book. So you can see they're very concerned about how we relate to this issue, and they've done, I think, some pretty good work. So I'm about ready to ask the panelists tonight to help tell the truth, and share the truth. Share it as you feel it. Share honestly. The justice issues that we face today need to be shared honestly. And I want to make it very clear that tonight's discussion is not a debate. It is a dialogue. And there's a big difference between a debate and a dialogue. A dialogue is you sharing your hearts, sharing where you are, and the rest of us respecting what you have to say and see what we might be able to learn from each other. But we're not taking after any of one about saying, oh, that's awful, that's terrible, you shouldn't. We don't get into that kind of talk when we're talking, when we're doing when we're doing the way we usually will always do it, and that is a dialogue. So you may have different thoughts. You may want to ask some questions just to help you learn a little bit more about what the person has to say. That's always okay. So we're going to begin now with the first question, unless anyone here has any questions of me before we start. We are ready? We're ready. It looks like I see heads nodding, we're ready. So this is the first question. There are those who believe that racism cannot be retracted in the United States. Black people will always be the faces at the bottom of the well. How do you respond to the critical race theorists who think that way? What gives you hope that there is hope? Any one of you can start.
it's hard to know what he's implying there. Black people will always be at the bottom of the well. Is there a biological reason? What are the factors that go into his making that? Is it a social constructed reality? And if in fact it's a socially constructed reality, can we reconstruct a different reality than the one that he is speaking about?
Well, I think that certainly the author of this book does not believe that. But the author of the book is saying that there are people who do believe that it's just not going to change.
Well, what he's saying, it seems to me, is that we're all sinners and that we can't be redeemed and get it right.
Well, Tony, do you think that's do you think that that's what a lot of white people think, or do you think we're on a different road?
Well, I don't know that all white people think that way, but I do believe there's a core of white people who do think that way, and I do believe that racism is so insidious that it operates on the unconscious level too. So those with the greatest of intentions may be doing things that create serious ongoing problems for African Americans in this country. But I would say it's an uphill battle. I mean, I think it's like Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill. And sometimes when he gets there, he lets go and it falls back down again. And I think that's been the reality. But I'm not persuaded by anyone who would say that it's impossible. Because if it's impossible, why would we even try? Why would we even be here? So
Do you think maybe then that they want us to think that way so that it doesn't change?
There could be, that could be. We do know that it's that it's very insidious, but we can see in a kind of push-pull way, we can see movement, we can see progress. We certainly have made a tremendous amount of progress since the mid-60s. And there would have been other times in our past where we made huge progress and we slipped backwards. I think it's a struggle that we must continue as a people, as a people of faith, that we must strive to improve. And so I personally, I'm not willing to say this can't be dealt with, this can't be changed, because I think it can be.
Well, you have a nice. Go ahead.
Two brief points. Thanks, Tony. First of all, what an interesting term, at the bottom of the well.
Yeah.
I mean, that's nothing that's not a term that we would normally use for this. If you look into a well, you're going to see one of two things. I mean, either it's a dry well, like as the one that Joseph was thrown into by his brothers. It was just scorpions and nothing else, and you see the person who is victimized. Or you look into the well and there's water there, and what do you see but your own reflection? So I think it's really an interesting concept. But if the question is, will racism always exist? And will African Americans, will the black face always be the one on the bottom? It seems that racism is a large part of the human condition, but I don't know that it will always be the black face that is the victim. I think that that I can see in several generations, the slow movement away from victimization of the African American, but there'll be someone else who's victimized. We have this thing inside us that causes us humans, if we don't fight it, if we don't rise up over it, to look down upon, to victimize, to blame others. So whether it's blackface or another face, it's for a very long time, I believe it will be around. And it is up to us, as Tony says, to continue to fight.
I think that we are looking at generations before it would be truly eradicated, but I think that it's a much more nuanced than just the way we feel about the other person. I think so much of it stems from the economic situation, right? So it's what I have versus what I don't want to give up versus what you have, versus what I think I should have that you have, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a nuanced conversation with lots of layers. But I also think that the primary reason that we still struggle with it so heavily right now is because we're not that far removed from Jim Crow. We're not that far removed from enslavement. My parents were Jim Crow parents, and they were racist, and they raised us to be racist. You see what I'm saying? So, and then, you know, my daughter is mixed race, and her great grandfather was enslaved. I mean, and these are part of my lived experience and I'm not that old. I'm gonna be 50 soon. You know, I think the other part though of the question was what gives you hope. The thing that gave me hope this past year during all of this pandemic was the George Floyd movement, and to see so many people out there. But the thing that I was very aware of, so many of them were young. And I thought that that was really the future, is that our young people are not accepting the status quo that so many of us were raised. Well, this is just the way that it is. You know what I'm saying? And like I know in the 90s in DC, when I first started dating my daughter's father, the KKK was surging. So, I mean, in my lifetime, the KKK has surged at various points in our nation's capital, which is where I happen to be from. And I think that it takes raising better children and so forth and so on. And I think that's why the concept of 7 generations becomes so relevant when you look at our tribal communities, where they focus on how many generations. I don't believe racism will be eradicated by my generation. I think it will be future generations that eradicate it, but it takes everybody to be willing to make the sacrifices that go into illuminating the cause, speaking the truth, and being a part of the movement. I don't think anybody can be silent, but I don't believe my generation will be responsible for it.
Well, would that be said for the generation that came at the 60s and 70s, that they said the same thing maybe? Hey, maybe this not our generation will be the next one, and now we are 60 years from that, and we're saying the same thing. It will be our next generation that comes in that can do that. I mean, are we?
It seems to me that the other, however we internally describe the other, that it's human nature that the other is seen as different and thus less. And it just seems like that's where most people come from. The way that we look at the world, whether the other is the non-American or the other is the Mexican coming across the border, however people look and describe the other seems to always be, to them, of less value. And that seems to put a constant refresh on who is the other. And if we look at it in terms of America and who they have as the enemy, when I was a kid, Russia. Oh my goodness, anything that was Russian was horrible. You know, now Muslim, you know, you look at this and you say, okay, it's that other that I can't ever figure out if we need an enemy and thus we create one. But getting people to look beyond that is at best very difficult. As I grew up, I did not experience any prejudice at all until I started wearing the hijab. And it was eye-opening to see how people could just, without saying a word, make you feel uncomfortable and like, maybe I shouldn't be here. And I see that now with people standing in line for anything. And as they look around, you know, it's like, okay, that little look is all it took that said, what are you doing here? I belong here, not you. And that's going to be a very difficult thing to get rid of. But what gives me hope is this group. At least there are people out there fighting to make sure that we continue to struggle against this, even when we feel like it's a losing fight. We're struggling and working towards it, and hopefully the next generation or the generation after will pick it up and really make it come about.
I have to agree with that wholeheartedly, and I think that from my perspective, and I grew up in racist America, and I was taught the big lie, you know, that white people are superior and all other colors are inferior. And until we can deal with the truth and expose that as the lie, the underpinning of all racism, I don't think that it will ever be retracted. The you know, as they were asking, can racism be retracted? But I think we can evolve. You know, if we can get truth to be taught and understood. And I grew up, you know, where you know, the Civil War was, you know, it was a war of northern aggression, you know, where it wasn't a war for, you know, all people to be recognized as people, you know, and the slave codes of South Carolina, which turned Black people into chattel property. There's still an undercurrent of that in America today. I mean, particularly in our police system, where, you know, they can shoot Black people without regard to their humanism. But, you know, I do see change. You know, I grew up in an era where, you know, there was open discrimination. You know, there were bathrooms for white people and Black people. They didn't serve you know, Black people in restaurants. You know, there has been some movement, and particularly in the 60s, I think we saw some through a lot of laws that were enacted. And it's as they were saying, it's one step forward and one step back. But I do think that the upcoming generations will be more enlightened. And if we can teach them the truth, you know, which not being taught in our history courses. We don't teach Black history. We teach white history. You know, there's the page of the Black man on a cabin, one page in a history book, and that's it. You know, as opposed to, you know, the Holocaust, you know, everything that Sam read. And until we can get that truth into all the schools and all the textbooks, you know, that we're all human beings, and that there have been great injustices that have been perpetrated upon Blacks in particular, but all minorities in America, that there won't be change. But I do see movement, and I do see some enlightenment. I think we can evolve. I don't, as Jan was saying, see it in our generation, because those people that have that ingrained in their soul, so to speak, will continue. I don't see them changing, but it's that next generation that I think we will see some change, and I hope that we see change.
I think we all. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Marlon.
I mean, just to speak to that, like, being part of this next generation and being a millennial, the scary thing to me is hearing the previous generation say, oh, it's going to be the next generation, and being a part of this generation and knowing that it's not this generation, where I'm in circles of friends and people that are my age group that still have that thought, those hatred thoughts ingrained in who they are. And so I think if we have the mindset to look and say, look to the next generation, it almost is a cop-out for this generation, this current generation. And I think if we're not actively attacking that in this current generation, then the next generation is going to be the same thing. Like I think it was Naeem that said, did the generations in the 60s say the same thing? Oh, in the next generation is going to be better, but it didn't. And in some cases, it got worse. And so to look just to the next generation, or just to say, well, a generation or two is what happens in the between time. How many more Black bodies will die in the between time while we sit and wait for the next generation? I think, like you said, the education is a huge thing where, I grew up in California and Black history wasn't taught. And it's taught from the perspective of white people. And so I didn't learn. Most of the stuff I learned was not even in college. I had to go do research on my own. And so that's a huge issue, because that's going to continue the same cycle, and the cycle continues over and over, because we're looking to the next generation.
It is the young people who are.
Let me clarify. I'm sorry, I wanted to just clarify that I wasn't trying to imply to pass the book in any way, shape, or form. I just think that right now we're still fighting for Black people to be able to walk down the street and stay alive and come home at the end of the day. We're not anywhere close to economic redistribution, which ultimately is where you get to eradicate racism, because that's a structural institution that goes from A to Z. And in this particular moment, the fight is still to make sure that Black bodies are not being killed every day. You know what I'm saying? So that's why I was saying I'm struggling to see it in my generation. We still are trying to fight to live. And for it to truly be erratic.
And for those
I just wanted to be clear, because I felt like maybe I had sound like it needed to be passed.
And for those who point out that there were young people demonstrating this past summer, there really were, and not only that, but they weren't all Black people, right? But going back to your analogy of the 60s, I was one of those kids in the 60s who was fighting for freedom, for liberty, for justice, and we thought we were doing something. But then what happens is young people get older, and they have other concerns, and it's not going to be the next generation. I think we're talking generations in the future, and slow change.
And I'm not using it's going to be the next generation as a cop-out. My daughter, I go, us old people, she's not, into anti-racism, but, anti-pollution, and I go, I'm hoping that you do better than we did, but it's not a cop-out that we can't do something here and now, and we have to do something here and now so that there is an evolution, that it keeps getting better. But I hope you didn't feel that was a cop-out, because I don't believe it's. I just think it's a reality check, and I know a lot of very racist people through my work, and particularly when we start getting down south of the Mason-Dixon line, and it's equal opportunity racism. I think in America, it's like it's in the North too. But there's some are so hardened, their hearts are so hardened. I don't see any chance that they'll change their attitudes, whereas I think young people are malleable.
Let me ask something here.
Can be affected.
As a white person, those of you who are a white person, you probably did not create the structures that give you an advantage. They've been there. They're with us. So are you, as white people, willing to continue to benefit from it? Or can we somehow reach out to the white people, such as I think this book and they're trying to do with the congregations throughout our country right now, that gives me some hope that we don't have to wait till the next generation. We can do some things already in this generation. So I'd like to know if some of you think that, particularly the white people, if you think that there's a way that we can give up some of our advantages. And the panelists of color here, do you observe times when white-skinned people seem to be taking advantage of their color? I imagine you see that quite often. But is there a way? Is there a way? And do you have any ideas as to why we don't have to wait till the next generation, but that we can actually reach this generation to begin to have them see how we can make a difference, and white people will understand what they really have done and what they need to change?
I think we white folks, it's so a part of our way of looking at the world that this is the way things are. It's not saying that someone who is oppressed should stay oppressed, but for us, that where we are, that's where we should be. And one of the most difficult things that we're going to have to do, and this is what I've been talking about with my congregation, is give up something that you have come to know through several generations. It's like where we are up here, we would like to raise everybody higher, but in reality, it means losing some of your privilege, and first learning what privilege is, and then losing some of your privilege to allow other people to be equal. Most white people don't see the privilege that we have.
Do you think, Rabbi, that it's possible that whites subconsciously know that they have an advantage?
I think many,
and are quiet about racial injustice for fear that they may lose them.
Yeah, yes, I do. I really do. As I say, people in positions of privilege, and I'm not talking about, again, when I think of someone in privilege, I'm thinking of someone who has all the money they need and they can do whatever they want, but someone who is not like that, they don't see themselves as having privilege. And so occasionally they will get a glimpse. They will get a glimpse of just how lucky they are, and they'll want to hold on to it tightly. It's going to be very difficult to get people to let go of some of it.
But isn't that part of actually like getting to the truth of it? I mean, the book talks about we need to tell the truth. We need to tell the whole story. That's part of it, I think. I mean, they need to put themselves in other people's shoes. They need to walk that walk with the other people, whether through banking system, in the judiciary, the court, the work, education, everything you look at. Okay, you have one step. You're 1 step or 10 steps ahead of everybody else because of the color of your skin.
Yeah, the issue though that goes to the heart of that though is once you're past the age of 13, all the studies show that the average white person has one colleague who may be Black, right? And that's someone that they know from work most often. So how do you get to the point of becoming familiar with that experience? For me, it was living with a Black man for 22 years. So like, and being disowned by my family. And so being absorbed into his and living his experience with him. Most people don't have that. Coming to Wichita, I was like, Wichita is white. I was shocked, honestly, because I was like, this is pretty white. And that's not what I'm used to in coming from DC. So I was immediately seeking out what I was comfortable with, which was diversity. The average person does not do that. You know, the average white person barely knows people of color, let alone enough to truly experience what they go through, to see the Black price, to be the only white person at the table and have the server only speak to them, even when everybody else is ordering. People don't get that as a general rule, to be in somebody else's shoes. So I think that's the real question. How do you get beyond that? Because we can talk about privilege all day. But when somebody is on food stamps and they're white, they're going, I'm not privileged. And they don't know anybody either. So how do you get somebody to willfully seek that out? Because it's painful. It's painful to watch. It's painful to experience. It's painful to be a part of it. And you're asking people to willfully suffer. And that's where most people don't want to go.
How
And
many,
most
how many
people,
men
most
understand
people
what it's
love,
like for a woman to walk down the street and have to change her route and for safety's sake? I mean, men don't get that either. This is, we can't make that transition. It's very difficult. I'm sorry. Mark,
Well,
what do
and
you listen?
if you've always been a part of a system, then you don't know that the system is corrupt. Because I mean, a fish doesn't realize what water is because he's been in water his entire life. And I think that's what we're dealing with is the fact that most white people don't even, as it's been said earlier, don't even recognize that they do have an advantage. And until you can get somebody to have to live your experience. But how can you live my experience if everything in the structure of your world caters to your experience? And so if that's the case, then you have to then choose. Now, Janet was a little bit different because of who she was married to, but you have to choose to come and live my experience. And here's the wonderful thing, or the horrific thing about that. If you choose to live my experience, whenever you get tired of it, you just go back to where you were. So that's not a genuine experience because you know you can always flip the off button.
Yeah.
And so it's going to be challenging. And I've seen it in some occasions where a white person would be in an environment that was mostly African American, and you could see the tension in them, not because we weren't friendly, but because this is a strange environment, and I really don't know how to operate in this particular environment. And I had to inform them and speak some truth to them and say, okay, you've just experienced 1 hour in my lifetime. And whatever you felt in this one little hour is how I'm feeling every day. So, and I think they learned something from that, but at the same time, they just flipped the switch off and went back to the world.
Going back to something that Marvin was saying earlier, is our education does not teach. Our whole system is set up not to teach the really the side of anyone who isn't American and white. And so if we can't incorporate that even into, I don't even see documentaries most of the time that really incorporate it. Even looking for them, I have trouble finding them. So how hard is it for that next generation that we are counting on, whether it is 1 or 3 generations down the road, to learn what really has been going on?
not just to speak to that.
Go ahead.
The education, and then also somebody said telling the truth. And I think right now we're in this age where no one agrees what the truth is, and I think that's a huge issue. It's like, how can we even talk about white privilege or talk about any of these things we're talking about when we don't even agree on facts? And that's a huge issue in this culture right now.
Where do we see white supremacy operating in our community in Wichita? Do we see it in primarily churches? Where do we see white supremacy continuing and making their word? I mean, continuing right on, not backing away at all. Where do we see that happening?
I think we see it in voter suppression. To start, we're not as bad as some states, but we've had some governors and some politicians that want to restrict the voting. And I listen to some of the people that think that the last presidential race was stolen. It's because Black people got to vote. You know what I mean? I mean, underneath it all is what they're saying. And we've got and they don't like that, and that's one of the more apparent places where it's at. I mean, it's certainly in the economic arena and you know, in housing, you know, in lending. It permeates every, you know, every part of our society. You know, the education systems that are available to our children. That's just what I see, and I just see it from an outsider. I don't see it as an insider, you know, of one that has suffered under it.
I think white supremacy is baked into our society, and I don't think you can really, I mean, yeah, you can try to point to specific examples, but that's just where it's manifesting. It's everywhere. Trying to say it's here, it's here, it's here, I see it there, I see it there, is like trying to say I can pick out sugar granules in a cake that I've baked. The sugar is in there. It's baked in there. I mean, white supremacy, our country was founded on the premise of white supremacy. It goes back to Columbus. Every structure, every law, every policy is from a white supremacist standpoint. I don't think you can illuminate, that's seeing the forest, but not seeing the forest for the trees, I guess is where I'm going with that.
But is it just white supremacy per se, or is it just supremacy because we feel supreme? I mean, we had issues with the Irish. We had issues, and they were white, and Christians. And we had issues with the Jews, and they were mostly white. So it wasn't. So it's not just because it's a race issue. I think it's a mentality of being superior to others. You have a privilege and you don't want to give it away. You have something, you don't want to share it. That's what it is. You're fighting everybody who cooks different than you and might take something from you that you think you got. And that's what the issue is.
You're 100% right. But the other thing to remember is certain groups don't become white until it's politically convenient. I'm Italian. The Italians didn't become white until the 1960s. So you are still really talking about white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism. The Irish didn't become white until they needed to gerrymander. White is a political construct. So
I think it goes beyond that, because I think, you know, that there is a prejudice and discrimination, but I don't think there's anything that's tantamount to Black people being brought to America as property. You know, and,
True.
And the 400 years of what's gone on is there's nothing tantamount to it. It's just horrific. You know what I mean? When you look at the history of it. And yeah, I was lucky enough to get a short course in Black history, and I had some ideas of what had happened, but I just didn't see it manifest in just generation after generation in different ways. You know, and there's something that's monumental there that needs to be dealt with, you know?
I mean, you addressed something earlier. You said the issue of vote suppression, and you said because of the last election here. I mean, this day, a couple of days ago or something, we have votes in states everywhere try to suppress votes for the next election. I mean, so it's like we just spinning our wheels. Is either people not listening, leaders not listening, or still the same issue. I don't want to share with you what I got. I'll do everything, legally or illegally, to maintain that power.
And I think implicit in all of this is color and the notion that there's something different from Black people than there is with white people, that these aren't, even though we know biologically through science that we share the exact same genes and only 6 of them are different. And those are the ones that have to do with the extent of melanin in our skin. But that really doesn't matter. There is something about color here and about the way the story was spun. We are not, whether the story was constructed, we are not equal. That's the way the story was constructed. We're not fully human. That's the way the story was constructed. We descended from apes. That's the way the story was constructed. I mean, this stuff runs, I think, very, very deep. And those who get through it and understand that all of that is not true are the ones who are free and they're thinking people. but there's so many who are not free, and who when they see me walking down the street are riddled with fear. And I may be the nicest guy in the world and wouldn't hurt a flea, but I would be a threat. The more pronounced than that, I could go to another country and feel that this is not just a American issue, that thing has taken flight and is all around the world, at least in places that I've been in the world. This is not a small thing. It's really quite deep. And I do believe that our biggest foe is those who are the white supremacists. And how do we value diversity? Maybe that's part of it too.
That is, but I think the question that Sam asked about here in Wichita brings home the point that when I think of a white supremacist, I'm thinking of the neo-Nazis and all that, the ones who are saying, yes, I'm proud to be a white supremacist. When others say that, they're speaking of pretty much everybody who sees the way things are and thinks that's the way it should be. And so to get to Sam's question, what we see here in Wichita, again, in my opinion, it's not even a black and white thing. It's a we and them. It's the us and the other. And the other could be Hispanic, the other could be Mexican, the other could be Asian, the other could be black, the other could be what side of town on which they live, and poverty or wealth. I mean, it's us and them. And the us who have the advantages, of course, they can look down at them, but it's always us and them. And we, us, hate them.
So it's not necessarily related to race?
I don't know. I'm beginning, in the back of my head, there's something that's festering there that's saying it's really less race than otherness, and however you want to define the otherness. And African American, because of the history, it's the history. It's not the color. It's not the melanin. It's not the gene. It's not the color. It's the history.
I wish it were true.
But
I wish
typically
my color wasn't a problem. I wish that my color wasn't a problem.
right.
Well, what I'm saying is, it's not the chemical. It's not the chemistry. It's the history of the of the culture.
Chicken and egg. Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I'm going to agree with Tony. I wish that it was something other than color, but all I feel is color. And you know what I'm saying? So I'm not going to duck that or run from that. But where do you see white supremacy operating in your community? I think I'll tag on what others have said. It's so woven to the construct of how people think. I see it everywhere. I mean, if you, as me as an African American man, would just look at the world. I mean, our community, I see it operating in the way people think, and I have to work harder to create the same opportunities that somebody else is just gifted with. That is a form of when you feel as though that you are superior to somebody else, it creates a whole mindset and structure of how you think, how you operate, how you see the world, how you live, and how you respond. And so I think it's so interwoven into society now, it almost is normal. And that's very challenging to me, because how do you make it abnormal unless you have enough voices or enough, let's call it like it is, color palettes to overcome it? And I think that the only way that as this is my opinion, a white person would see it differently, is if the shoe somehow was forced to be on the other foot, and then perhaps you would know how it feels and how it operates. So I think it's almost ingrained into society, and I think it's a way people think. And I don't know if you can, change that. I think that eventually maybe it will lessen, but then again, I haven't seen, it seems like I've seen an increase in the generation that I am, and I'm the last of the baby boomer generation. I mean, it seems like it has risen to a higher degree in the generation that I'm in.
I think it's safe to say that some of the things that we've been experiencing in the last decade have to do with the changing demographics that people of color are coming here, and that's threatening, and that has to do with color.
I think part of that too is the wealth gap has exploded in our generation as well.
Right.
That makes it polarizing in so many ways.
Right.
You know, and
Right.
I think that also makes it harder for lower income working class white people to open up their eyes and go, no, my skin color is not making this harder on me. Everything else and the white male privilege at the top that is making, like, owning the 1% and keeping it from everybody else. So then everybody else is fighting for that little tiny bit that's left, you know? And so when you take color, which has been polarizing this country from its founding, and add in this explosive wealth gap, that's just a volcano. Just exacerbates it.
I keep thinking that there ought to be something that we could do different that would speed this up. And, you know, in that book, she writes, most Black people suffer in silence. And she goes on to say that they just suffer, and then they find their place in a worship service that's like them, and they can enjoy that, but else they just suffer all the time. And that's what she wrote one place about Black people. And I'm wondering what you think about that. Is there some way, you know, when I look at most churches, there's some churches are changing a little bit, but most of us are either white churches or Black churches. And on the west side, there isn't a Black church, so the people that live on the west side seem to go to the east side to have their worship experience, and so it just seems like they say, all right, can't do much about it. I'll just live with my own Black people, and we'll, you know, is that happening, or is there a way that we are beginning to find that we see relationships so important? You know, Bill, you're a wonderful guy. I love you, because I got to know you. There's a relationship. So I think of so many of the people that, Tony Brown, we've done so many things together. I don't think about his color. I mean, he's just someone that's just so much fun to be with. Why can't we build those kind of relationships? What can we do to build those kind of relationships?
Can I share? And at least
Sure.
I believe is the truth of that. So yes, I spent 22 years with a Black man, and it's a lot like waking up in the Matrix. And then all of a sudden you see the truth of what you're living in. But what that also means is displacement. Suddenly you can't, you hear what the white people around you are saying, and you don't fit there either, right? So to wake up and realize what is happening in this world and the truth of the racism and the truth of what we are doing to anybody that is not white means you are no longer part of that white community anymore, because now you have to be the truth teller, and they don't want to be around you when that's what you're doing constantly. You have to be willing to stand apart, and because you're never going to be Black, you're never going to be more than a witness, and you're never going to be able to do more than give testimony.
So you're making a statement as to what you think white people should be doing.
I'm saying that is the reality, and that's what you're asking people to do, and most people are not willing to do that. So in order for us to move forward, white people have to collectively realize this, but then if enough people do it, you have a new community. But we going to wake up from the Matrix. That's what I'm saying.
Marvin?
I agree. I think in order for to build those relationships, like you talked about the relationship that you have with Pastor Van, is to how do you say it? Create spaces where I can come and be vulnerable and share my experiences without having to defend my experiences. I think for me, I mean, the reason why you'll see Black people congregate together is because I can go to my mom's house and talk about an experience that I had and not have to sit there and be on the defense and defend the thoughts that I had in that moment or the experience that I had. And so when I come into a room at work or in ministries that I serve in, and I've experienced some type of discrimination, and I share that in that room, and then there's eye rolls or there's the feeling like, oh, I don't think it was that. Maybe you're really just looking at it too hard or whatever it is. Then at that point, now you've lost me. Now I'm going to retract and I'm going to go back into my circles and with the relationships that I've built where I can be vulnerable at.
In other words, you have to be open. And that's something that we can do as individuals. It's going to take a long time before we can do that as a society.
I think that it's at that individual place where it begins, and I think anyone who is white or Black or whatever, who want to live in a better society, they're going to have to engage. And part of the trick is to help people in the dominant culture to realize how they can profit by engaging. And, we've got many opportunities to engage in terms of becoming involved politically, or right now with the whole voting rights things happening across this country. There are so many things that we can do outside of the context of our own congregations, but getting involved politically, I think, is a good start. But I think if I get to know you and I share my story and you share your story, and we may find points of where we don't agree, but if we stay in the conversation, I think there's tremendous hope. And I think part of the reason why young people were out there on the streets is because this generation has had more interaction with each other across these racial divides than my generation has. So there was already some empathy built in. But I also think that some of these young people felt like white people felt like victims too, for a lot of reasons. And so that was a wonderful thing to behold. But if someone just wants to be my friend and wants to hear me talk, but not engage, then for me, that's a problem. Because if I have a friend that I care about and they're hurting and I just listen, that's just step number one. But if they could help me, that would be step number two. And if we were in this together, seeing that we could all profit from making some of these changes, then we would be doing something quite significant, and we would be essentially working against sin. Because perpetuating racism is sin, and we're not as inclined to talk about it that way, but it's sin. And I think there's hope if we can be in each other's lives.
We have five minutes left. So let's share what you really want to, that hasn't been said yet, that you really would like to see being said. Please share it, because we've just got about 5 minutes left.
I think Tony hit on something very important. It is to define it as a sin. If we can get that driven through the places of worship, that this behavior is a sinful behavior and it is a stand against God, you might get a seed planted in people's hearts and mind, so that actually contemplating, is their action actually sinful and turning against God? That's a great point.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I'd like to go back to what Sam had said, and I think Marvin, you commented on it, the notion of being open, of the reason that Sam and Tony and Sam and Bill, as Sam had said, can relate the way they did, the way they do, is from being open, both ways. And that is an individual thing. So if every one person who can find an opportunity to be open to hear what someone else is saying, without, or at least setting aside temporarily the filter that we always use, and to hear their concerns. And we do that when we love someone. We do that with a spouse. We do that with a sibling. When we love someone, we are open to their concerns.
Mm-hmm.
And so if we can reach out and open ourselves up to hear not only the words, but to hear the fear, the concern, the worry, that's behind it, that might be a first step.
So it's really building relationships. Yes?
Yes, it really is building relationships, and relationships. One of the things that is very hard is to, once you have reached out and you've got the openness with one over here and one over there, then making that into a group and then bringing in one more and then one more, because it's one and one and one as it grows. And if each person brings in one more and we can still be open and we can still share, then we're making progress. The minute that it closes down, you've got to go back and start doing again.
Well, maybe this is a good spot to stop on. We've got a minute. And I want to say thank you to each one of you. You've been so helpful, and I really appreciate what you all have shared, and you all got involved in it. And there's about 8 or 9 questions that I've got here that I never asked because I didn't need to, because you were bringing it out. You were answering the questions that didn't have to be asked. So thank you so much for sharing this. And you have a bunch of people that are listening, and you've got some congregations that have advertised this. So if they don't listen to it tonight, they're going to listen to it throughout the week. So what you have had to say is not just something that just is being heard tonight. It will be heard other places as well. So thank you so much. I think you all have added so much to this, and we've got to continue on. We've got to find a way that all people are treated equally, and that color makes no difference. We just have to be able to do that. And I think all of you are the kind of people that can make it happen. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam, for having this. And I'm delighted to meet Marvin and Janet and Leah. Yeah. Thank you.
Nice meeting you all.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, have a good night.
And Mike, too.
Good
Thank
night.
you, everybody.
Bye-bye.